What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Stronger TV. I'm Kiefer Lammi, here with world banana research leader Dan Pope. We've been talking about bananas all morning. Unfortunately, that's not the topic of today. Today, we're talking about building strength overhead. Okay, so there's a few different areas we want to cover with this, being position, stability, strength, and then kind of your variation and accessory, and we'll work our way through this, and hopefully it makes a lot of sense for you guys. But Dan, why don't you lead us off? Let's talk a little bit about building overhead positioning.
All right, good. So I guess the first and most obvious thing is if I have to be able to press something overhead, if I don't have the range of motion to press something overhead, it becomes more challenging. And it can be challenging for a variety of reasons. For one, if I don't have good overhead range of motion, I can compensate for my lower back. And in some athletes, especially like a split jerk, right? If you couple that with an error in the back leg, there's a lot of extension, sometimes the low back gets painful. I think the other common compensation that you see is when people don't have the range of motion to press straight overhead. You see this sometimes with handstands just because being so strict and close is so important. They end up going a little bit wider. And it's really hard to weight shift side to side if you don't have that range of motion. The other part is if you're doing handstand push-ups and you simply can't get fully overhead, it's hard to lock out just because you don't have this strict position here, so you're fighting against your own mobility. So from a performance perspective, it makes total sense. You need to have that range of motion to be strong and then get in good positions, not
Sure.
hurt.
Yeah, I think the obvious thing, right, is that the better your positions are, the better you're able to stack up overhead, right, the more efficient you're going to be. So efficiency is super important for a couple of reasons. One, you're probably going to be stronger if you're more efficient, right? If your jerk positioning is more efficient, you're going to get under more weight more easily. The second thing is you're going to be able to train with higher frequencies and higher volumes without kind of jacking yourself up, right? Like, I know there's a million ways that we could do a lot of different things, and everybody's technique's a little bit different, but chances are the more efficient or the better your technique is, the more you're going to be able to handle before you start dealing with stuff like injuries or setbacks, right? Because, say you don't quite get overhead all the way you want to, and you always had this little bit of a compensation with your low back, or you always have a little bit of extra forward head motion, right? Yeah. That might not bug you now, but if you try to train 3 or 4 times a week with this and you're building up to high intensities over time, like, it might come back and bite you in the butt.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? And from a performance perspective, if you get hurt, that's a great way to get worse at your sport. So the more you can train, the more you can push that envelope and not get hurt, the better you're probably going to be.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I think, for a lot of people, some of this stuff starts to come up as the intensities get a little bit higher, right? So I do think it's important that we spend this time on, drill work or skill work at lower intensities, and you're building up good habits as you go versus, jumping right to your max loading and figuring out, I have all these compensations that might not have been there if I spent more time at my base training.
Yeah, agree with you there.
All right, our next one we wanted to talk about is stability. Okay, so stability you could think of a lot of different ways. In some ways it's really tied in with strength, but you had a nice way of kind of separating out the way we think of strength versus stability. So why don't you go with that?
Yeah, so when I tend to think of stability within the shoulder joint, I think about the shoulder's ability to decrease kind of micro movements that may be occurring. One of the things that happens when you press overhead, when you bring your arms overhead, is that you do have a little migration of the ball superiorly in the socket. And one of our thoughts in terms of getting things like shoulder impingement, which is probably the most common thing we see in shoulder pain patients, is that if we're getting too much migration overhead combined with too much loading of that tendon, it can become a little bit painful. So just having a really strong rotator cuff to help to manage some of that motion within the shoulder joint is going to be important, right?
Yeah, I think the way we describe it to a lot of people to make it super simple is, your strength is how strong the big guys are, right? So like your deltoid muscles, everything that we see around the shoulder. Your stability is how strong or how efficient the little guys are. So all the ones inside that are kind of controlling micro movement within the joint, right?
Yeah, you got it. I do have a little bit about chronic pain. This is my own little theory, but a lot of people will have a low level of pain in the shoulder pretty much at all times, right? So if you're, let's say, a strongman athlete or Olympic weightlifter, sometimes the shoulders are just painful. It's just part of the sport. So one of the things that pain does is it will inhibit muscles. They won't necessarily fire as well as they should. The timing will be a little bit off. So I do think it's extra important that we do think about the little guys because they probably can't handle as much stress as some of the bigger ones. I mean, you can even make the argument that pressing big weights overhead is not something that's natural that the human being was ever created to do.
Sure.
So we need to make sure that we're managing this as best we can, doing basic rotator cuff work just to make sure that we're keeping those working appropriately. Yeah.
Cool. And then what would you have on fatigue management? Discuss this a little bit more for us.
Yeah, so this is something that Mike Reinl talks about a lot, but as the rotator cuff starts to fatigue, so if you do lots and lots of exercise for your shoulder, we get decreased control within the ball and socket joint, right? So what ends up happening is that if we have decreased control within the ball and socket joint, we can increase some shoulder impingement, which again is one of the major things that we talk about as a problem within the strength and conditioning world. So if we are getting the shoulder very, very tired, then asking it to tolerate, a big heavy load overhead, we might be running into trouble.
Sure.
So part of that might mean is that those big sets that are maybe like a 9 out of 10 RPE might be a little bit harder for the shoulder to handle than maybe say, let's say the hip or the knee or another joint.
Yeah, I think this kind of ties into stuff on both ends of the spectrum here. And, as far as fatigue management goes, I think it plays a lot into your programming and how you appropriately build up to this stuff. So you're building, chronic training volume so that you can tolerate these heavy sets later on in training. But I think also it probably plays a lot into your positioning and your stacking, right? Yeah. I think the more efficient your positions are, the easier these little guys are going to be able to handle what you're doing versus kind of fighting to hold on, right? And you're going to be able to tolerate this stuff longer without feeling that same sort of fatigue. Because I think, just the same way as Mike talks about it with baseball, right? The more efficient a pitcher's motion is, probably the more volume he can handle before he starts to have any issues. And we don't know this for sure, but that's my thinking for it.
It's very logical. Yeah.
All right. And then strength. And this one starts to get a little bit gray and it separates out because it's super, super goal specific, right? But I think building strength for something like strongman versus Olympic weightlifting versus just general overhead strength for, the everyday trainee is super different. You kind of have to approach it differently. Mm-hmm. But I think, the thing we want to talk about with it is kind of this tethering of volume versus frequency and even intensity as you go through it, mm-hmm. right? So if we know that these things are super important as we go through, your positioning is important, building good stability and building some, chronic training volume so that you can tolerate fatigue a little better is important. I think that the idea of having a base phase is necessary for somebody, right? Yeah. So lower intensities, right? Maybe even lower frequency, and you're trying to build up volume over time for that person. I think it's hard sometimes because sports like strongman, sports like Olympic weightlifting, which you have a little bit more experience in than me, kind of rely on your ability to push or press, max loads into that overhead position, usually for one rep or not for very many, right? So why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I guess going back to your whole goal-specific thing, I think that's probably important because one of the major differentiators between Olympic weightlifting and then strongman is that generally with strongman, they use more of a push-press motion, mm-hmm. and it really depends on the athlete. So athletes that have a background in Olympic weightlifting, maybe they use a little bit of a jerk, but for the most part, if you're pressing a log, you can't really land underneath of it the same way you would with the barbell.
Sure.
So what happens is it's more of a pressing motion. You have to press through the full range of motion. For Olympic weightlifting, it's usually a dip with the lower body, and then you drop underneath it and catch it. And I think what ends up happening is that this pressing range of motion through here is more stressful than just dropping underneath the weight and catching from that perspective. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the reasons why Olympic weightlifters get away with a lot more jerk volume than, let's say, a strongman that maybe has their volume a bit lower, mm-hmm. So that comes into play when you're trying to program appropriately for those athletes. My thing was, when I was doing a lot of strongman, I would follow more of a kind of a traditional West Side split where I'd have a max effort day and then I'd have more accessory stuff towards the end of the week. So I would work up to, let's say, a 5-rep max or something along those lines with a log or an axle or something like that. And then I would filter in some additional accessory exercise, maybe that's a dumbbell overhead press or some incline press throughout the course of the week. And usually that stuff would be higher volume but lower intensity, whereas the main lift would be much higher intensity but much lower volume.
Sure.
And that was kind of my preferred way of training for that. But
sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think what's hard is that for something like Olympic weightlifting, the training is a little bit different. And traditionally you don't see people doing more than sets of 1, 2, or 3 reps for most of this stuff, right? So I think what becomes important is that rather than having training volume in the more traditional sense of higher rep sets, the frequency is a little bit higher, and they use more kind of specific variety. So you're doing, jerks from a rack versus an actual clean and jerk versus, different jerk positionings, or you're doing jerk recoveries or something. So they find all these accessories, they tether them throughout the week, and you try to build up your volume that way. Versus, if you're push pressing or strict pressing, it's not that uncommon to see sets of 5 or 8 or 10 throughout the training.
Okay. I do have a question for you, though.
Yeah.
So say you have a newish athlete, let's say they're an Olympic weightlifter, and they've been doing this for like a year or so. They're
Sure.
definitely not at the top end of their abilities, right?
Sure.
How often throughout the course of the week would you have them do, like, let's say, a jerk or an overhead press?
Sure.
Something like that.
I guess this is a good topic to talk about. This is kind of the same way we would progress anything else, right? If our goal is to be able to tolerate high levels of specific training volume, early on we probably have to build higher levels of general training volume, right? So to start, we might only be doing actual jerk work once or twice, and we're working more on technique. But throughout the week, we might have 1, 2, or 3 training days. We're doing some sort of overhead pressing, some sort of horizontal pressing, and then of course like traditional pulling accessory work to try and build a more robust shoulder. So your goal is, we've built up the ability to handle 15 to 20 sets worth of work for the upper body, and then we're slowly building how much of that is specific to the sport as they get better.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah, so kind of periodized, like early on in the training year or something like that. You have a little more volume of accessory stuff, and over the course of time, you start doing less and less accessory and more of the specific strength exercise. Okay, very good. Yeah.
And I think, we've talked about this before, but you kind of have this pyramid of performance for most individuals, right? So if here's our pyramid, and here is kind of the peak or the pinnacle. Right? This is your Olympian weightlifter, right? There's very few exercises that are going to actually make them better at jerking or get them stronger overhead, right? So their training is going to be super specific. They're going to have high volumes of that specificity, right? But the lower your skill is, right? Or the lower your strength or your skill is in any way, right? The more exercises there are that can help you kind of get stronger at that. So if we approach it this way and you think, all right, I've got a beginner and I want to teach them Olympic weightlifting, well, early on, there's a ton of different exercises we can do. They're going to get better regardless because, whether they're just jerking once a week or twice a week, they're still going to get better each time they do it just from learning the skill. So we can afford to fill in a lot of that training with more general volume. And the better they get, so the higher their skill level gets, the stronger they get, the less exercises are going to have that sort of carryover for them.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you just have to be very specific at the top. At the bottom, there's a lot of wiggle room in terms of how you program for these guys.
Sure. And so at the beginning, we place a big emphasis on stuff like their positioning, right? So maybe that's mobility work, that's general positional work, it's doing overhead carries and stuff to try and build that for them, right? Yeah. Filling in the gaps with some additional stability work. So maybe they're doing the more boring, rotator cuff and scapular exercises. And we're starting to work on their strength through specific skill work. Right? And the better they get, if we've built this foundation really well, the more time we can spend on the specific strength work.
Great, I like that. Yeah. How about the variation accessory stuff?
Sure, so we kind of covered this, but this is, that last piece is using variations or using accessory work to help build the lifts. Right, so we talked about this, the less advanced you are, the more time we're going to spend on that. So I would imagine for overhead stuff, if your sport is weightlifting and the split jerk is your skill, right? Anything that's a deviation away from that is going to be variation or accessory work.
Yeah.
Right, so if we're talking to somebody that's, going to American Open Nationals or something, right, then that might be just different variations of the jerk, right? But if we're not at that level, that might be strict overhead pressing work, unilateral stuff, right, which you don't get a lot of, overhead carries. It might be horizontal pushing and pulling to try and balance out some of that strength. So again, this variation or accessory work is super dependent on where you're at with your training, but I do think it carries a ton of merit, even for somebody that's highly skilled, maybe in like an off-season phase. And the closer they get to competition, the more specific these things get.
Yeah, I like that. I'm a physical therapist, so my big thing is making sure people don't get hurt, My thought is that accessory stuff is great for preventing injury, right? The other thing is if you're trying to inject more volume into your program so you build that robust shoulder that can handle more of the specific training over the course of time, like I said, I think this is where a lot of the bang for your buck comes into play. The thing is, at the end of the day, people have to perform really well, right?
Yeah.
So there has to be a period in time where some of the accessory stuff kind of goes down. So for me, I'm kind of like the guy that's always trying to push a lot of the accessory work, but the other part is like we have to keep in mind, like you can't just do accessory stuff all day. That's not always the thing that's going to build the strength that you need to perform at a high level.
Yeah. And it's tough, right? Because we kind of understand that higher chronic training loads could lead to better injury prevention over time for people, right? So the more time you spend building up so that you can tolerate a lot of training, probably the more robust you're going to be and the lower your chance of injury, right? At the same time, really high chronic specific training loads could be what leads to some sort of overuse injuries for people, right? So I think that's where you kind of see the cream rise to the top. It's like, all right, if you can tolerate this, you're going to do well, but if not, you're going to be another person that got hurt trying this program.
Yeah.
So it depends how much you want these things, but I do think it plays a big, these other things we talked about as far as building really, really good positions, building really, really good stability, right? And spending time on the base levels before you build up could have a huge impact on how well you tolerate those things once you do get there.
Yeah, I agree. Sweet. Anything else for that?
No, I don't think so. I think we pretty much covered it. So, here's kind of our 4 pillars for this stuff. It's building really good overhead positioning, getting super stable, getting super strong, and kind of building your skill up over time. And I think you're set up for success.
Boom. I got to get to a banana conference, so.
All right. Dan's got to go to a banana conference. I don't know what I'm going to do, but thanks guys for listening. If you like this episode, please share it with your friends, comment below, and stay tuned for the next one.